Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. On the outskirts of a small town called Oak Ridge, nestled in a valley forgotten by time, lies a place where smiles have turned to nightmares and fun has turned to tragedy. Somerville Amusement Park was once the beating heart of childhood joy, but decades ago, a horrific accident sealed its fate, leaving behind a landscape of decay and despair. Drawn by legends and mysteries, few dare to cross its rusted gates. This is the story of a man whose curiosity led him to face the terrors that lurk in the shadows of the park. I have always been fascinated by abandoned places. My name is Tomas, and I am a photographer. I specialize in capturing the melancholy, haunted beauty of forgotten places. When I heard about Somerville Amusement Park, I knew I had to go. The stories of missing children and ghostly laughter were irresistible. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the decay and the echoes of the past. I arrived at Oak Ridge late in the afternoon, the sun setting behind the mountains, casting an orange glow over the ruins. The entrance to the park was covered in vines and graffiti. The colors faded, and the rusted iron gates creaked to the touch. I took a deep breath, adjusted my camera, and walked through the gates, a shiver running down my spine. The surroundings were surreal. The once vibrant rides were now covered in rust and vegetation. The imposing Ferris wheel seemed to silently watch over the park. As I walked, I could hear the wind whispering through the metal structures like muffled voices telling horror stories. I began snapping photos, capturing the macabre beauty of the place. The pale colors of the Ferris wheel's cabins contrasted with the dark sky, creating a powerful image. As I walked, I noticed that some of the rides moved slightly in the wind, making unsettling creaking sounds. The carousel was the centerpiece of the park. Horse by horse, their figures were weathered by time but still maintained a sinister look. One of the horses seemed to follow my movements with its glassy eyes. I approached, and when I touched the wooden mane, I felt an icy sensation pass through my body. Suddenly, I heard a childish laugh, faint and distant. I looked around, but there was no one there. The sound seemed to come from all sides, echoing between the attractions. I continued exploring, but the feeling of being watched did not leave me. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of my vision, dancing and transforming into indistinct shapes. I arrived at the House of Mirrors, a place that has always been known for its eerie atmosphere. The mirrors were broken, and the few that remained intact reflected distorted images of myself. I entered, feeling the oppression of the place. Each step echoed, creating an unsettling sound. The walls narrowed as I advanced, and the feeling of claustrophobia increased. When I reached the center of the House of Mirrors, I saw something that made me stop. In the mirror in front of me, there was a figure behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one. The reflection was still there, a figure of a dark-looking man in old-fashioned clothes and a vacant stare. I tried to take a picture, but the camera failed. Fear began to take hold of me, and I hurriedly left the House of Mirrors, feeling as if something was following me. The park seemed darker now, and the wind carried with it indistinct whispers. I passed the ghost train, whose wax figures had melted, creating grotesque images. The eyes of the figures seemed to follow me as I walked. The creaking of the tracks and the sound of the ancient mechanisms added an extra layer of terror. As I walked away from the ghost train, I heard footsteps behind me. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps also quickened. I stopped suddenly and turned, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Only the emptiness of the park and the oppressive feeling of being hunted. I arrived at the puppet theater, a place that exuded an aura of sadness. The puppets were hanging from their strings. Some had fallen to the floor, their faces painted with expressions of joy now seeming to mock me. The velvet curtains were moldy, and the stage was covered in dust. As I stepped onto the stage, I felt a strange vibration. I looked down and saw a small, secret door. Curious, I opened the door and went down a narrow staircase. The atmosphere grew colder as I descended. The dark corridor led to a hidden room beneath the park. The walls were covered with children's drawings, but there was something deeply disturbing about them. They seemed to depict scenes of pain and suffering. In the center of the room, there was an improvised altar with broken toys and melted candles. Around it, old photos of children who had visited the park. The air was heavy, and the feeling of sadness was overwhelming. I felt a presence around me, and the whispers became clearer. "Help us." The voices echoed, pleading. I felt an ice-cold hand touch my shoulder. I quickly turned around and saw an ethereal-looking girl with sad, pain-filled eyes. She seemed to be trying to communicate something, but her words were slurred. Before I could react, she disappeared, leaving me alone with growing fear. I ran up the stairs trying to get out of that horrible place. Upon reaching the top, the park looked different. The lights on the rides were on, and the sounds of laughter and screams echoed through the air. It was as if I had been transported to a distorted version of the park. I saw indistinct figures moving between the attractions, shadows of children playing and adults watching them. It all felt like a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. I tried to find my way out, but the park felt like a maze, with each path leading to a new nightmare. Finally, I reached the entrance, but the gates were closed. I heard a familiar laugh and turned to see the dark-looking man standing there watching me. His gaze was one of pure malevolence, and I felt a deep terror when I realized that he was controlling everything. "You can't escape, Tomas." His voice was an icy whisper, cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. He began to slowly approach, and I felt my body lose strength. The surrounding shadows closed in on me, and darkness took over. When I woke up, I was in the hospital, with wounds all over my body and a searing pain in my head. A doctor explained to me that I was found unconscious on the road, and that my car was destroyed. They said it was a miracle I was alive, but I knew the truth. The spirit was still outside, waiting. The cursed route hadn't finished me, and I knew that one day I would have to face that man again, that haunting presence that haunted me. While recovering, I planned my next trip. I couldn't run away forever. The terror of the road had marked my soul, and I knew that to find peace I would have to face the cursed route again. I knew I couldn't rest. The voices still whispered, and the nightmares haunted me every night. I decided to investigate the park's history in depth, looking for any clue that would help me understand the origin of that curse. I spent days in the city library, immersed in old files and reports from local residents. It was there that I discovered the dark truth about Somerville. Decades ago, the park was the scene of a macabre ritual carried out by a cult seeking power and immortality. The cult leader, a man known as Ethan Blackwood, was obsessed with finding eternal life, and to do so he sacrificed countless children, imprisoning their souls in the park. Blackwood mysteriously disappeared, but his evil presence never left Somerville. With this new information, I returned to the park, determined to end the curse once and for all. I arrived at dusk, when the shadows were beginning to lengthen. The atmosphere was heavier than ever, and the wind seemed to carry the whispers of the souls trapped there. I went straight to the puppet theater where I knew the altar was hidden. I walked down the stairs carefully, feeling the oppression increase with each step. The room was the same, but now there was something else. In the center of the altar, an ancient leather-bound book was open, with strange and incomprehensible symbols. As I approached, the pages began to turn by themselves, and I felt a presence around me. I looked back and saw Ethan Blackwood, his imposing figure and eyes full of hate. He laughed, a laugh that reverberated off the walls of the room. "Did you come to put an end to my work? How foolish." His voice was cold and cutting. I picked up the book and began reading aloud, trying to recite the words that could break the curse. The lights in the room flickered and the shadows seemed to come to life, dancing around me. The children's voices rose, screaming for release. Blackwood advanced toward me, his presence overwhelming. I felt an invisible force push me back, but I continued to recite the words, my voice shaking with fear and determination. The shadows approached, and Blackwood's macabre laughter echoed through the room. "You can't defeat me," he shouted, but there was a note of desperation in his voice. With one last effort, I shouted the final words of the incantation. An intense light exploded from the book, illuminating the room and momentarily blinding me. The shadows were swallowed by the light, and I heard agonized screams as Blackwood disintegrated, his form crumbling into dust. When the light dimmed, the room was silent. The children's voices were gone, and the oppression was gone. I climbed the stairs feeling a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The park was quiet, the attractions still, finally at rest. As I was leaving the park, I felt a small hand touch mine. I looked down and saw the ethereal girl, now smiling serenely. She made a gesture of thanks before disappearing into a soft mist. The souls were free, and so was I, at least for now. When I got home, I fell into bed, exhausted but with a sense of accomplishment. Finally, he could rest, knowing that the terror of Somerville had been defeated. But as I closed my eyes, I heard one last whisper, faint and distant, like an echo from a dark past. "We'll meet again, Tomas." I knew that although evil had been defeated, the scars of that night would remain. And so I fell asleep, ready to face any shadow that the future might bring. On the outskirts of the small town of Pedra Branca, a Victorian mansion stood majestically, but had long been abandoned and shrouded in mystery. Known by locals as the Mansion of Secrets, the house had belonged to the Antunes family, who had mysteriously disappeared 50 years ago. Since then, the mansion had stood empty, accumulating stories of sinister and unexplained events. No one dared to approach the place, but curiosity and necessity can often overcome fear. My name is Lucas, and my wife Anna and I were desperate for a change. With our young son, Pedro, we needed a fresh start, away from the city and the stress. When we saw the ad for the mansion for sale at a ridiculously low price, we felt it was a sign. The house seemed perfect for us, spacious, surrounded by nature, and with an old-fashioned charm that immediately enchanted us. We arrived at the mansion on a sunny afternoon, and the view of it against the blue sky was stunning. The structure, although worn by time, still maintained an imposing presence that made us feel small. The windows were tall, and the red brick facade was covered in ivy. It was as if the mansion was waiting for us, hiding its secrets in the shadows of its walls. As soon as we walked through the front door, a cold sensation enveloped us. The interior was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the air smelled musty and abandoned. But what bothered me most were the noises. Footsteps and whispers seemed to echo through the hallways, as if the house were whispering old, forgotten stories. Anna tried to liven up the atmosphere by opening the windows and letting the sunlight in. Pedro ran through the hallways, exploring every corner with the curiosity typical of a child. However, something in the house seemed to be wrong. At night, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows thicker. One night, while we were in the living room trying to relax after a day of cleaning, Pedro ran in, frightened. He said he was playing in the attic when he saw a shadow move. We tried to calm him down, telling him it was just his imagination, but I decided to check it out for myself. I climbed the stairs to the attic, the feeling of cold growing with each step. The attic was dark, lit only by the dim light from a broken window. I walked slowly, the wood creaking beneath my feet. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just darkness and oppressive silence. I went back down to the main floor, trying to shake off the discomfort. Anna suggested that maybe we were just tired and needed a good night's sleep. I agreed, although the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Objects moved on their own, doors opened and closed without explanation, and the whispers became more and more clear. It seemed like the house was alive. Trying to communicate something, Pedro began having nightmares and talking about a friend he only saw at night. A tall, pale man who seemed to come out of the walls. One afternoon, while cleaning the basement, we found a hidden door behind a shelf. The door was locked, but I managed to break it down. Inside, we found a secret room filled with old papers and photos. There was also a diary, which belonged to Rosa Antunes, the matriarch of the missing family. The diary was full of disturbing notes about rituals and sacrifices. We discovered that the Antunes family was involved in macabre practices, trying to summon something that would grant them eternal power and wealth. As we read, the house seemed to react. We heard loud noises, as if something was moving on the upper floors. We ran upstairs, and what we saw paralyzed us with terror. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the air was thick with negative energy. That night, we decided that we had to leave the mansion. As we packed, the whispers turned to screams, and the shadows began to move independently, surrounding us. We tried to run to the door, but it slammed shut behind us. We were trapped. The terror reached its peak when Pedro began to scream. We ran to his room and found him in the corner, shaking with fear. In the center of the room, a shadowy figure materialized, tall and pale, just as Pedro had described. The figure watched us with empty eyes and an expression of pure malice. Anna held Pedro tightly as I tried to face the figure, but each step toward it was like walking against a storm of icy wind. Finally, I remembered Rosa Antunes' diary. I ran to get it and began reading aloud the banishing rituals she had written. The figure screamed in agony, and the house shook violently. I continued reading despite the paralyzing fear. The light around us began to glow brightly, and the figure dissolved into a cloud of shadows. The house was silent. The next morning, we left the mansion. We were exhausted, but alive. The feeling of imminent danger still hovered over us, and we knew that that house held secrets that should never be revealed. Back in the car, with the suitcases piled high, and Pedro sleeping restlessly in the back seat, we exchanged a silent look. No words could describe the terror we had experienced. As we drove away, the winding road seemed endless, and the mansion, despite disappearing in the rearview mirror, remained etched in our minds. We found temporary refuge in a small hotel in the neighboring town. The idea was to rest and plan our next steps. That night, however, sleep did not come easily. The shadows seemed thicker, the whispers still echoed in our ears, and the feeling of being watched persisted. The next morning, I decided to return to the mansion alone. I knew something had been left behind, something we needed to understand to truly escape its influence. Anna protested, but she knew my decision was made. I drove back to that red brick monstrosity, now with new determination. Upon entering, the feeling of cold and oppression immediately returned. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful quiet. It was the silence before the storm. I climbed the stairs, feeling the steps creak beneath my feet. I went straight to the attic, where Pedro said he saw the shadow for the first time. The attic was dark and cold. The dim light coming in through the broken window provided little illumination, but it was enough to reveal an antique trunk in the corner of the room. Upon opening it, I found old documents and photographs depicting the Antunes family in various bizarre ceremonies. But what really caught my attention was a small wooden box, locked with a rusty padlock. I went downstairs with the box, feeling a growing urgency. I knew there was something crucial inside her. Back at the hotel, Anna and I forced the padlock, and, inside, we found an iron amulet and a set of letters written by Rosa Antunes. The letters detailed a sinister pact made with an ancient entity. promising prosperity in exchange for human sacrifices. As we read, Pedro began to cry. He pointed to the corner of the room, where a shadow was forming, growing and taking the shape of the figure we saw in the mansion. The figure approached slowly, and the air around us seemed to freeze. Ana grabbed Pedro while I tried to remain calm. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered, his voice an echo of despair and anger. With the amulet in one hand and the cards in the other, I began to recite the banishment I found in the cards. The figure screamed, and the room began to shake. Lights flickered, and objects flew across the room. I continued reciting, my voice steady despite the fear. The figure began to fade, but before disappearing completely, it left one last warning. "You have awakened something that you cannot control. I'm not the only one." The mansion, with its dark secrets, still had more to reveal. We knew that our time there was over, but we also knew that the ancient entity would not leave us alone so easily. We decided that we needed to destroy the mansion and everything it contained in hopes of breaking the curse once and for all. We gathered all the evidence, the letters, the amulet, and anything that could help us convince the authorities of the need to demolish the house. It was a hard fight, but we finally got the support we needed. On the night of the demolition, we watched from afar as workers destroyed the structure. As the first walls fell, a piercing scream echoed through the area, as if the house itself was crying in pain and anger. The shadows danced frantically, but the light from the machines and torches seemed to keep them at bay. Suddenly, the ground began to shake, and a fissure opened where the basement had been. Thick black smoke began to pour out of the crack, forming contorted faces of pure evil. The workers retreated, terrified, and we felt that our presence there was necessary to finish what we started. With the amulet in hand and Ana by my side, we began to recite the banishments one last time. The smoke billowed violently, but we continued, each word spoken with conviction. Finally, the fissure began to close and the faces in the smoke disappeared one by one. When it was all over, silence fell over the area. The mansion was reduced to rubble and the feeling of oppression was gone. We knew we had closed a dark chapter, but the opening for continuation was there. A constant reminder that evil can take many forms and that our battle for peace and safety, it was just beginning. We returned to our new home, far from Pedra Branca, with the hope of a fresh start. However, always vigilant, aware that true terror may be lurking, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The story of the Mansion of Secrets had come to an end, but we knew that the fight against darkness was endless. The demolition of the mansion should have been the end of our problems. The authorities had declared the area safe, and we, exhausted but relieved, returned to our new home. Ana and I tried to return to normality for Pedro's sake, but the terror we had experienced in the Mansion of Secrets had left deep scars. One night, shortly after we settled into the new house, Pedro started having nightmares again. He would wake up screaming, saying that his pale friend was back. Ana and I exchanged worried looks, trying to convince him that it was all just bad dreams. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. One morning, I was awakened by the sound of whispering and low laughter. I left the room and went down the stairs with a feeling of déjà vu coming over me. When I entered the room, I saw Pedro standing in the middle of the room, staring into the dark corner of the room. The air was thick and cold, and shadows seemed to writhe on the walls. "Pedro, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking. He slowly turned to me, eyes wide with terror. "Daddy, he's here," he said, pointing to the dark corner. I followed his finger, and my heart almost stopped. The pale figure, more vivid than ever, was there, watching us. It was as if all the evil we tried to destroy had followed us, finding a new refuge in our home. "Ian, I shouted, trying to wake her up. "Ana, get down here now." Ana ran down, and when she saw the figure, her face turned pale. We knew we needed to act quickly. I took out the amulet I had kept as a grim reminder of what we had been through, and began reciting the banishments again. But this time, the figure did not retreat. It seemed to feed on our fear, growing in strength and intensity. "It will not work," Anna shouted, her voice full of despair. "We need to find another way." I looked around, looking for something, anything that could help us. It was then that I noticed that the shadows around the figure were moving in a peculiar way, as if they were guided by something else. It was as if the figure was manipulating the environment itself. Suddenly, the figure advanced, crossing the room in a swift and frightening movement. Anna held Pedro tightly, trying to protect him. But the figure passed me by, its icy touch making my skin burn. I screamed in pain and fear, but continued to recite the banishments. The house began to shake, and the lights flickered violently. The shadows stretched, trying to envelop us. I knew we were fighting something far more powerful than anything we had faced before. With one last effort, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a handful of salt. I remembered old stories about how salt could ward off evil spirits. I ran back to the room and started spreading the salt around Anna and Pedro, creating a protective circle. The figure screamed in rage, its voice echoing through the house. The shadows retreated slightly, and for a moment, the pressure eased. I continued spreading salt and reciting the banishments, my voice echoing along with the figure. Suddenly, the figure began to disintegrate, its form shattering into thousands of smaller shadows that dissipated into the air. The house stopped shaking, and silence fell over us. The figure was disappearing, but the feeling of danger was still present. "We achieved?" Anna asked, her eyes full of tears. Before I could respond, one last shadow rose from the ground, darker and denser than the others. The pale figure had been but a manifestation of true evil, which now stood before us in its purest and most terrible form. "You cannot destroy me," the shadow whispered, its voice full of malice and hatred. "I am eternal." Desperately, I picked up the amulet and, with all the strength I had left, threw it into the center of the shadow. The amulet glowed brightly, and the shadow began to scream, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. The light grew, filling the room and burning the shadow until it disappeared completely. The silence that followed was deafening. We sat on the floor, exhausted and shaken, but alive. The house was quiet, and the feeling of oppression was gone. We knew that the evil we faced was ancient and powerful, and that this victory was only temporary. We needed to be always vigilant, always prepared for the next battle. Our lives would never be the same, but we were determined to protect our family and our sanity, whatever the cost. The story of the Mansion of Secrets had come to an end, but the fight against darkness was just beginning, and we were ready to face any challenge that came our way, with the courage and determination to never give up on the light, even on the darkest nights. Deep in the forest, where the sun's rays can barely penetrate and the silence is only broken by the whispering of the trees, lies an abandoned hospice. This place, once a refuge for those society would rather forget, now stands as a grim monument to madness and despair. Stories about the site have circulated for years, told in hushed tones by those brave enough to venture near its decrepit walls. For a group of thrill-seeking young people, the asylum was not just a challenge, but a promise of adventure and mystery. However, what they found went far beyond what they could have imagined, revealing buried secrets that should have remained hidden. My name is Lucas, and this is the story that changed my life forever. Since I was young, I have always been fascinated by abandoned places and the stories that surround them. When my friends, Pedro, Julia, Renata, and I decided to explore the old Hospicio San Bartolomeo, we were just looking for a different thrill, something to break up the monotony of our lives in the small town of Serra Negra. With a backpack full of flashlights, cameras, and provisions, we set out on an autumn afternoon, as the leaves were beginning to fall and the air was filled with an unsettling sense of change. We arrived at the hospice just before sunset. The imposing building stood before us, its ivy-covered walls and broken windows looking like empty eyes watching us. There was a heavy atmosphere around the place, as if the land itself knew of the horrors that occurred within. Ignoring the chill that ran up my spine, I moved forward with the others, trying to maintain my courage. Pedro, always the most fearless of the group, was the first to enter. "Let's go, guys. We didn't come all this way to give up at the door," he said, pushing the wooden door that creaked loudly, as if complaining about the invasion. We entered, one by one, and were swallowed by the darkness inside. The smell of mold and decay hit us immediately. The dim light of the lanterns only partially illuminated the wide hallways and empty rooms, where rusty metal beds and abandoned wheelchairs stood as silent witnesses to a disturbing past. We walked in silence, each of us lost in thought, trying to imagine the lives of those who once occupied that place. The first sign that something was wrong came soon after we entered the north wing. Julia, who was filming our exploration, suddenly stopped and pointed to a half-open door. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper. We stayed quiet, trying to listen beyond the sound of our own breathing. There was a faint scratching sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the other side of the door. Pedro approached and, with a quick movement, opened the door. Anything, just an empty room with papers scattered across the floor and an old cabinet against the wall. "It must have been the wind," said Pedro, trying to dispel his growing fear. We continued our exploration, but the feeling of being watched never left us. Renata, who had always been the most sensitive of the group, began to look increasingly uncomfortable. "I don't like this place. It feels like the walls are whispering," she said, looking around nervously. We arrived at a larger room, which appeared to have been a common area for patients. The windows were all broken, allowing the moonlight to partially illuminate the room. In the center of the room, there was a round table with chairs around it, and in the corner, an old piano covered in dust. That's when things started to get really scary. As we explored the room, we heard the sound of the piano playing a slow, melancholy melody. We turned around, and there, sitting at the piano, was an indistinct figure. Before we could react, the figure disappeared, leaving only the echoing sound of the last note. Panic began to set in. "This is not normal. We need to get out of here," said Julia, her voice shaking. I agreed, feeling fear tighten my chest. But Pedro, obstinate, insisted that we should continue. "We came here to explore and document. We can't leave now." Reluctantly, we moved on, but the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the whispers on the walls became clearer, as if many voices were trying to warn us of something. We arrived at the treatment ward, where the most violent patients were kept. The feeling of despair was overwhelming, as if the walls were absorbing all the suffering they had witnessed. In one of the rooms, we found an old diary, almost falling apart. The yellowed pages told stories of cruel experiments and inhumane treatments carried out by doctors. Most of the patients never left. Their souls seemed to have been trapped, cursing the place. As we read the diary, we heard a high-pitched scream coming from the hallway. We ran to see what it was and found Renata lying on the floor, unconscious. All around her, bloody handprints crawled across the walls. We tried to wake her up, but she was in a deep trance, muttering incomprehensible words. "We need to get out of here now," I shouted, taking Renata in my arms. Running through the corridors, the feeling of being followed was inescapable. The building seemed to close in around us, the whispers turning into screams. We reached the exit, but the door was locked. Desperately, we looked for another way out, but it seemed like all routes were blocked. It was then that Pedro, in an act of desperation, started knocking on the door with a piece of wood that he had found. The door finally gave way and we ran outside, feeling the cold night air envelop us. We didn't stop until we reached the car, where we could finally breathe a sigh of relief. As we drove back into town, I looked back and saw the silhouette of the asylum moving away, its shadowy presence still haunting my thoughts. Renata began to wake up, but it felt different, as if a part of her had been trapped in that place. We got home and promised never to return to Hospicio San Bartolomeo again. But the marks of that night have not disappeared. Renata was never the same, and the whispers of the asylum continue to haunt us, even from a distance. Now, as I write these words, I know that the terror of that night is far from over. The madhouse may be behind us, but the shadows it awakened are still among us, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The weeks following our escape from Hospicio San Bartolomeo were a blur of sleepless nights and days of constant vigilance. Renata, who had been most affected by the experience, continued to show signs of trauma. She mumbled incomprehensible words in her sleep, and her hands often moved as if they were being guided by an invisible force. We tried to help, but we knew something inside her had changed forever. Me, Pedro, and Julia decided to meet one night to discuss what we would do next. We gathered in my apartment trying to find a way to deal with what we had experienced. Pedro, who had always been the most skeptical, was beginning to show signs of fear. "I don't know what to think anymore," he said, looking at the handprints that were still burned into his mind. "I think we brought something from that place with us." Julia agreed, her eyes showing the same terror I felt. "We need to find out what happened in that asylum. Maybe this will help us understand what we are facing." We decided to go back to the building where we had found the diary. Maybe there would be more information about what really happened there. Before leaving, I asked Luisa, my girlfriend, to keep an eye on Renata. We needed to make sure she was safe. Upon returning to the building, a feeling of déjà vu came over me. The oppressive atmosphere of the place seemed to have intensified since the last time we were there. We entered the building guided only by the dim lights of our flashlights. The hallways were long and endless, and the silence was unsettling. We arrived at the room where we had found the diary and began looking for more clues. It was then that Pedro found a secret compartment in the floor, hidden under an old metal plate. Inside was a wooden box full of old documents and photos. The documents detailed horrific experiments carried out by the asylum's doctors. There were reports of patients being subjected to inhumane torture in the hope of curing them of their mental illnesses. The photos showed faces of pain and despair, people who had been forgotten and abandoned. Among the documents, we found a letter from one of the doctors written in a desperate tone. He described how the experiments had gotten out of control and how the patients began to show signs of violent and supernatural behavior. The letter ended with a warning. "The souls of those who suffered here will never find peace. They are trapped between this world and the next, and their fury cannot be contained." As we were reading the letter, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the corridor. I turned off my flashlight and told the others to do the same. The sound of footsteps approached, and the tension in the air was palpable. We saw a shadow move on the wall, and my heart sank. Pedro held a metal bar, ready to defend himself, but the shadow passed us without stopping. We waited until the sound of footsteps disappeared before turning on the flashlights again. "We need to get out of here," whispered Julia, her voice shaking with fear. I agreed, and we started walking back down the hallway. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and the whispers on the walls became louder and clearer. We arrived at the entrance hall and were greeted by a horrible spectacle. The shadows of patients appeared on the walls, their faces contorted into expressions of agony and rage. They moved towards us, their hands outstretched as if they wanted to grab us. We ran to the door, but it was locked again. Pedro started hitting it with the metal bar, desperately trying to open it. The shadows were getting closer and closer, and I could feel the cold of their presence around us. Finally, the door gave way, and we ran outside, feeling the cold night air envelop us. We drove back to town in silence, each of us lost in thought. We knew that the terror of the asylum was not behind us. The souls of those who suffered there were trapped, and their fury continued to haunt us. When we arrived home, we found Renata sitting in the living room muttering to herself. Her eyes were empty, as if she were in another world. I tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond. Louisa was worried and suggested that we seek professional help. But we knew that what we were facing was not something that could be treated by doctors. That night, as we tried to sleep, we heard whispers coming from the walls again. The shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, moving around the house and creating disturbing shapes. I felt an intense cold and a feeling of oppression that paralyzed me. Suddenly, the figure of one of the patients appeared in my room, his eyes fixed on mine. He reached out and whispered, "Help us." Absolute terror gripped me, but before I could react, the figure disappeared, leaving me in a state of panic. The next morning, we decided we couldn't continue living like this. We needed to find a way to free the souls trapped in the asylum. We returned to the building armed with salt and candles, hoping to perform a ritual that could bring peace to restless souls. We entered the asylum again, facing the oppressive atmosphere and incessant whispers. We arrived at the main lobby and lit the candles, forming a protective circle with salt around them. We began to chant the words of the ritual, feeling the presence of souls intensify around us. The shadows began to move frantically, as if they were fighting the ritual. We felt a strong, cold wind, and the candles flickered, threatening to go out. We continued chanting the words, focusing all our energy on the liberation of souls. Suddenly, a bright light enveloped the lobby, and the shadows began to disappear one by one. The sound of whispers turned into an agonized scream, before finally ceasing. The oppressive atmosphere disappeared, and a feeling of peace took over the place. We left the asylum feeling that we had finally done something to help those tortured souls. But we knew that the impact of what we experienced would never completely leave us. Renata began to show signs of recovery, but the trauma was still there, latent. As I write these words, I know that the battle against terror we face is not yet over. The shadows of St. Bartholomew's Hospice may have receded, but the darkness they awakened within us continues to haunt us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears. And so, my story continues, marked by fear and paranoia. I know that the fight for my mental peace is constant, and I hope that one day, finally, I can find true tranquility, away from the shadows that still surround me. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears. However, even with the apparent calm we found after the ritual, something inside me says that our fight is far from over. Sometimes at night I still hear whispers coming from the depths of my mind, reminding me that peace is only temporary. The dark presence of Hospicio San Bartolomeo left deep marks, and I know that one day I will have to return to face the darkness that still lurks in those decrepit walls. Until then, I continue living, trying to find some normalcy in a world that has been irrevocably changed by the terror I witnessed. And with each new dawn, I am reminded that the real battle for my sanity is yet to come.